Allie with the Potomac Bead Company, and I am playing around today with some caging in of gemstones. We've done videos caging in gemstones with some wire, and thought it would be kind of fun to cage some gemstones in with beads. So during our creative time at our store, Ashley came up with this one. I was playing around with some seed bead variations, and then I played around with another seed bead variation if you want to do smaller beads as well. So I'm going to show you how to do this kind of caging effect with the bugles, and I'll also explain how to do it with the seed beads in case you don't want to use the bugles and you want more of a seed bead look. It looks really good as a long necklace, and what you're going to need to have for the seed bead caged gemstone is a gemstone or a piece of quartz or some sort of material that is irregular in shape, kind of looks better. Elongated is kind of the idea going on here, especially because I'll be using the bugles. But any sort of stone, it doesn't matter if it does have a hole in it, because you're going to be focusing on wrapping the actual thread and beads around the stone. So I have a hunk of Labrador in this one, and a piece of abalone, and a piece of amber here. I'm going to be doing another piece of amber. I love amber, and this is some of the natural chips that we have of amber. They come on a strand, and the hole's actually in the middle of it. And if you need any of the materials to do this seed bead bezel of the gemstone, or the seed bead cage rather, on the left-hand side here, we'll do a little drop-down menu, and that drop-down will show you links to all of the different materials that you can purchase online. If you don't see the little drop-down, it may be because you're on a phone or because you're on a tablet, and that may not appear for you. Underneath the video, there's a little video descriptions, and if you click on the little Show More button underneath those descriptions, it'll give you links to all of the different materials that you can purchase from us online. Or you can go to your local Potomac Bead Company store and shop there as well. So I'm going to be creating another piece of amber caged in. I have the seed beads, which I'll explain kind of how we build and how we do, but I'm going to be doing some bugle beads. So the bugle beads that I have sitting near me here are some check bugles, and these are check bugles in 12 millimeter in the bronze pale gold color. And because this is a shorter piece of amber here, rather than this long piece of Labrador or this kind of big hunk of that abalone, I'm not going to be really needing that many of them. You're looking for a smaller piece into using about 12 or so of them. In addition to the 12 millimeter bugles, I also have sitting out here the 6 millimeter bugles as well. Again, or I'm sorry, 7 millimeter bugles rather. And these are the check bugles as well, in that same bronze pale gold color is what I'll use them in. As far as seed beads go, in the middle, that Duracoat matte galvanized gold in the Miyuki 11.0 is kind of a perfect match to the gold if you want it to be all one color. And I'm going to be using the aluminum silver color in the 11.0 seed bead. I'm going to finish off my pendant with some leather, and I have some Greek leather here in 1.5 millimeter in the brown color that I'll be using to kind of close off this whole necklace and to make it actually hang. And I'll probably attach some of the leather or chain to some of these other little hanging stones as well. It's a really modern look. I like kind of the stained glassy look of it, and they look really nice again hanging long. To thread the whole thing together, I'm going to be using some 0.006 wildfire beading thread in night green color. And in addition to that, I have a size 12 beading needle that I'll be working with. You want to make sure to have a nice workable surface here and a nice mat to kind of lay your things on, whether or not that's a bead mat or a bead on it board that you want to be able to transport things around. Have a nice workable surface. It'll make it easier with this bead weaving for you to pick up the beads. You may also want to have near you, and I kind of can't live without mine, this is the Thread Zap 2, or there's the Thread Zap Ultra, or the Cord Cutter by Beadalon. So there's a bunch of different varieties. They all do the same thing. And they're all going to burn down your thread. Not only do I use this to get the thread off the spool, I also use it at the ends of the thread to kind of burn down the little edges of the thread as well. I also usually have handy and near me a pair of pliers that are flat on the inside, whether or not they're bent flat nose or needle nose pliers, you can use that to kind of flatten out the thread at the end to make it easier to actually thread your needle and attach that to it. So this video here again is going to be using the seed beads to build your cage around your gemstone or your piece of coral or even a piece of clay. It's kind of up to you. Can have holes, cannot have holes. We're not going to be utilizing or using the holes, so it kind of doesn't matter for that particular form and method. To get started, we are going to be using our bugles, like I said, and some 11O seed beads. If you do want to do it just with seed beads, go ahead and kind of watch through this video as I explain that you'll basically be counting out the amount of seed beads that you need in order to figure out exactly how long to make the piece. So to get started, the biggest thing is knowing how long you need to actually make your piece when you're working on it. It's a difficult thing to figure out because when you are actually going in and trying to kind of figure out the length and what you're going to be doing, you need to have the piece there and you need to be able to measure it. So you can either measure it flat with a ruler, or you can measure it in the curved form when you actually put your beads on your thread. I'm going to start out with my thread and my needle here, adding a bead called a stop bead. A stop bead is a bead that will come off the project, but is used to just literally stop the beads from falling off the end of the thread. And I should have mentioned about 24 inches of beading thread will get you done with something about this size. It's about an inch high and about at its thickest point, we're looking at about a half an inch, a little bit less than that wide. So I have my stop bead on, which I put my needle through the bead 2 times, and I have a little bit of a tail exposed at the end, usually about 1 to 2 inches. Whatever you feel comfortable holding on to make a knot, that's what you're going to need at the end. So if you don't feel like you can make knots really with an inch of thread, leave yourself 2 inches of thread. To start out at the top and the bottom of the piece, when I'm adding my bugles or my seed bead, I'm going to use an 11O seed bead. So whether or not I'm using my 15 O's or my 11 O's, I'm going to use an 11O at the end. So I'm going to put an 11O onto my needle here and drop that down to the stop bead. If you are determining that you want to use seed beads, you're going to string a lot of seed beads onto your thread and needle to figure out how many seed beads you need to go from the center of one end down the side to the center of the other end. Because I'm using the bugles, it's going to be a lot quicker than counting. In my piece here, which is approximately the same size of the amber there, I used 20 of my beads high till I got to my middle section, 3 high in the middle, and then 15 beads high on the top. And that again is about an inch long piece here. And it is that piece of amber, and that's with 15 O seed beads. If you are doing something longer, obviously you will need more beads. So I have 20 and then my grouping of 3, which we'll kind of go over how we're doing that, and then an additional 15. Because I'm using the bugles, I don't need to think that much about the math, which is kind of nice. I have my long bugles, which are my 12 millimeter, and I'm going to put that onto my project first. From there, I'm going to add an 11O and then pick up one of my 7 millimeter bugles. I'm going to pick up another 11O and pick up one more 12 millimeter bugle. After the 12 millimeter bugle, add an 11O. I'm then going to stretch this kind of around the project and make sure, again, that it is about an equal length to the piece with just a tiny bit of room to curve and to kind of lay over the piece. You can see in Ashley's piece that she did here, she ended up using 2 bugles at the top and the bottom in order to get her length and to make sure that the piece would sit inside of the cage. What I'm going to be doing now is actually taking off this last bugle and this last seed bead, because I'm going to be doing what's somewhat like a little bit of right angle weave in the middle section here. So to get started in the middle section, once I know that I have my height right, and again, if you want to use bugles, but the height is a little bit off, keep in mind you don't have to use two long ones at the end. You can use a long and a short, or you can just use some additional seed beads. Like I said, that Duracoat matte galvanized gold in the 11-0 seed bead almost matches identically. So if you do want to just do 3 seed beads or so, you can do that. In the center section here, what we're doing is actually right angle weave. With my 15-0 seed beads, I used 3 groupings of 3 in order to make my little square here. In the piece that Ashley did, she used her 3 groupings of her bugle beads. I'm going to be doing the same thing, 3 groupings of bugle beads. So I'm using my 7mm bugle beads, and I'm putting them on after the first bugle with an 11-0 between each. So I have my bugles here and my 11-0 seed beads, and I'm going to make sure here that I have on my 3 bugles with 2 11-0s between them. What I'm going to do to make that little square and to get ready to kind of hold my amber in place is take my needle and thread and go back up through the 11-0, the bugle, and the 11 that were on the thread originally. When I pull that around, you can see that makes my first little cage area. To top it off and to make it the correct length then, add one of the 12mm or 2 if you have a longer piece. And after that, add 1 more of your 11-0 seed beads. That's going to be that first piece of our little cage here. So when you're looking at this one here, that's that first little row of caging. Or if you're doing seed beads, it's that first row of caging here. To continue now, I'm going to keep adding basically all these little boxes right around the row. And I'm going to do this in a flat way, and then we're going to go ahead and kind of sew it all up and attach the piece inside. To come down to the next section, grab another 12mm bugle, sew through the 11, the bugle, and the 11 that are on the opposite side of the box that you just made. It's going to make a little almost house formation. When I'm coming out that 11-0 then, I'm going to do my 3 bugles. So I have my 3 bugles in the 7mm that are going to be next to one another with an 11-0 between. To round that out, what I'm going to be doing is coming back down the 11-0, the 7mm bugle, and the 11-0 that my needle was previously coming out of. And that's going to build my next little box. Go ahead and give the thread a tight pull to make sure that you don't have any extra thread exposed. Coming out the bottom of that next little box, add another 12mm bugle to finish off the length. After the 12mm bugle, add 1 more 11-0. You want to make sure that you add the 11-0s because those are essential for us to kind of connect the whole project together at the very end of the project. To create the next little section, and I'm going to end up with about 5 little sections of my cubing here, and it will depend on the size of your piece, how many basically rows wide you're going to make this. To start the next section, I add another 12mm bugle, sew up through the 11, the bugle, and the 11 on the right-hand side of the previous box, and that's going to make a little triangle at the bottom now. Coming out that 11, bugle 11, add 3 more of your 7mm bugles. Get a couple more out here. And again, always remember that you want an 11-0 in between those. And I'm doing my 11-0s in the silver color for this piece, so you can see it as well. So again, kind of getting into that right angle weave, I'm using an 11-0, a bugle, and an 11-0 coming up towards the top. Giving a nice little tight pull in there. Add one more of your size 12 millimeter bugles, followed by an 11-0. From there then, we'll get ready to come down the other side and continue on adding our little boxes. So once we're at the top again, and this will create kind of our third little spike or little pyramid, or that little triangle there, we're going to add another 12 millimeter and then come down through the 11, the 7 millimeter, and the 11. It creates that next little spike there. And then again, rounding out, you're going to add a 7 millimeter bugle, an 11, 7, 11, 7. And that's going to create our next little cube. Come down then through the 11, the 7 millimeter, and the 11. And there we have our little cube. So at this point we have 4 of our little boxes, and as you create, you want to measure kind of along as you go to make sure you know when you need to stop, that you're not going to make the piece too big, that the ends are going to come together, that you're not going to make it too tight. So mine actually is pretty good. I think I'm actually going to take that last piece off and show you how to connect to the ends. If you need to go longer, you can keep going. And that's kind of up to you. If you're getting to the point like me that you have these 4 boxes and my piece is so thin that it encapsulates it with those 4 boxes, I'm actually going to backtrack a little bit and take off my side pieces. So if you get to the point where it is big enough, I'll kind of start from that position. What we're going to do is connect our edges. So to connect our edges, you kind of saw how it was getting rounded out here. And what I'm going to do is use one of my 7 millimeter bugles after coming out the 11 and the 7. Pull over to the other side, go through the 11, the 7, and the 11 on the opposite side of the piece. What that's going to do is start connecting the two and making a little box. Coming out the top then of that left-hand side, add another 7 millimeter bugle and come back down the original 11 bugle 11. And you can see that makes a little cage almost, or a little right angle weave there. To finish it off, I'm going to grab one more of my 12 millimeter bugles and connect it to my original end. To connect it to my original end, I'm going to go through the 11-0 seed bead from the stop bead towards the bugle end through that original 11-0 right at the end of the stop bead. And that's going to make my second little peak there. So you can see I've made that little cage basically for it to sit inside of. Before you go any further, you want to make sure that your piece does in fact fit inside that cage, and that you'll have room to kind of pinch around the piece and that it's not going to pull at the cage at all. To close off my cage then, I am going to be using some 11-0s between the 11-0s that were already there. So you can see here in this caged portion, I ended up actually with 3 of my peaks on each end, whereas this one just has 2 peaks on each end. You're going to grab 1 to 3, it depends on kind of the shape of your piece, of your 11-0 seed beads when you're coming out of an 11-0, and circle around, sewing through the 11-0 of the other peaks. So if you have 3 peaks, you're going to circle through all 3 of those 11-0s, adding 2 11s in between. In my case, again, I just have 2 peaks, so I'm adding 2 11-0s, sewing through the 11-0 on the top of the triangle across, adding 2 more 11s, and then sewing back through the original end. That's going to close off and get that little prism-like effect that it closes off the entire end then of that piece. So then what I can do is kind of push the piece of amber down in and see kind of how it fits. So this amber is a little bit wider than my previous piece at the end, which came more to a point. So I'll go back in, take out the 2 seed beads, and add in 3 or 4 seed beads between my 2 points. So I've gone back into the piece and I added 3 seed beads instead of 2. And what I'm going to do is actually close up the one end. To close it up, I am sewing around those seed beads, the 2 originals that were at the peak, and the 2 groupings of 3 that I added on the side. When I get back to that stop bead, I'm going to take the stop bead off and tie the 2 thread ends together. So you should have extra thread. Mine I always keep a little bit short so it's not too long to keep in the piece. So I'll be adding a little bit extra piece of thread. You should have yours long enough. I'm tying some square knots, so you'll have one that the needle's still attached. And you want to tie some square knots in there to finish off that end. If you want to, one of the original thread end where the stop bead is, you can take that with your burner and just burn it down a little bit. We'll go ahead and actually close it off and kind of glue it at the very, very end. From there, what we're going to do is take our thread and needle and go up through one side of our bugle row here and come out at the top of one of our other peaks. So I'm taking that thread and needle, and I just added a little bit of thread to mine, and I'm going up to the top of the opposite side. So I have the one side closed off. If you do have a piece that is a little bit bulbous in the middle or a little bit odd shaped, that it gets bigger in the middle and smaller on the ends, you may need to have your piece kind of in there already. If it's not straight down, it may not kind of slide into place as you're working with it. So you may have needed to do that already because it is going to have that pointed end and you want to make sure that the piece kind of fits nice and inside. So this piece here, I'm actually a little bit tight when I get to the top, and I don't have a lot of extra space here at the top. With this piece, it was the complete opposite, that I had a little bit more space than I needed. And with this one here, it doesn't really matter. It's kind of moving around. You have a lot of extra space at the top. If you get to the point where you don't have a ton of extra space at the top, you can add extra space by adding extra bugles, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to add about 2 seed beads. And if you do have that your piece fits nicely inside, you're just going to add your same amount of your 11-0 seed beads like you did at the bottom. Here at the top for mine, I'm going to add 2 11-0 seed beads and a bugle, and then 2 11-0 seed beads, and sew over to the other 11-0 that's sticking up on the opposite side. And there's so many factors in this because each gemstone, that's the awesome thing about gemstones, each gemstone is going to be a little bit different shaped. So you may have to do this and kind of play around a little bit with the design as you're working on it, as you get to one of the ends and seaming up. So I'm adding the same thing on the other side. And I have my 11-0, my bugle, and my 11-0s. I'm going to go right over to the 11 on the opposite side and kind of create a cage at the top here. And the piece is in there securely. It's not going to come out at all. And that just has another little cage at the top. And I think I'll actually make that the bottom and kind of flip my piece to the top. But just like I did at the bottom section, then I'm going to go ahead in and sew that nice and tightly together, reinforcing it. by sewing it back. If you wanted to sit a little bit more separated, you could even add 11 O's in between in that same kind of right angle weave that you'd add an 11 or one of the 7mm bugles in through the bugles, and that would separate that out as well. So you could do that too in the design if you wanted to. I'm going to sew that back out and just take that off, because I don't really care if the two pieces kind of sit right next to one another. And again, anytime you're working with natural materials like natural gemstones or natural shapes, there's going to be variables to it that you're going to have to kind of work around. So as I get this bugle back off the piece, then we're going to continue kind of reinforcing and going through those couple beads at the end. So I've gone around twice reinforcing those little extra bugles that I added at the end of my seed bead cage here. And what I'm going to do is actually make the bugles at the bottom here, the actual bottom of the piece, and make that loop area at the top of the piece. I'm going to take my seed bead or my needle and thread back up through the project again along one of those little bugle lines, coming out towards the top. I'm going to kind of just take that last little piece of thread that I have and just incorporate it into the project. If you have a little bit of thread end left, you can tie it off to that original thread end if you didn't burn it down. Otherwise, you can just kind of weave it back through your piece. If you want to, you can make a loop at the top of the piece. I did this one with 15 seed beads, just looping into that top section of those beads around the circle of the cage. You can see those bottom beads in the circle as well. What I'm going to do is actually, I have a jump ring sitting here. Rather than making a little seed bead loop, I'm just going to open up my jump ring and connect to there. So I'm sewing back through my project just to kind of get rid of my thread. And tighten that up. Once I have that, I'll sew on to go underneath one of the bridge threads and make a loop. Sewing underneath the bridge thread, creating a little bit of a loop, sewing through that loop, and pulling the thread nice and tight. When I'm done with that, I'll take my thread burner, burn my thread end, and then take my needle, or take my thread burner and burn it down even more against the project. Get rid of that knot. I'll flip over to the top now and get rid of some of the knots right at the top where I added some thread as well as where that starter piece of thread was. Once I have those burned down, and I can even burn them down a little bit more, you want to make sure that you burn them down and not through the knots that you created. But that actually creates almost like a stop. Again, if you have your loop on, you can have your loop where you just sew on some 15 beads from one side to the other. I'm, like I said, just going to sew through that seed bead loop that I created with any size jump ring that's going to be appropriate to fit into the actual cording that you have. Again, I went with 1.5mm leather, and I'm just going to make this piece hang long and kind of have that natural look to it. Taking a piece of my leather cording and go right through that loop and create the little necklace out of it. Just gives a nice natural kind of earthy look to it. I can do the same thing if I've done the actual whole thing in seed beads, sewing through and creating it and making a nice and long piece of crystal or amber or whatever gemstone you may be using. At the very end of the piece, I'm just going to take the leather in whatever length I want and just give a little trim. Go in then and put the loop through it. And then when I have it that I can fit it over my neck, staying with that kind of natural look, I'm just going to double the leather over and pull it in a knot. If you don't want the piece to slide around the leather, you can, if you want to, kind of tie a loop right at the end and double knot it so that way it hangs from the end as well and it doesn't come off the loop that you've created. But I know there's a lot of factors in this, and this is one of those, like I said, with the natural that kind of went back and forth about doing a video on it because there are so many variables. But it gives you guys an idea, and it gives you hopefully some inspiration to take some of the stones that you may have, and you may have had them sitting around for a while, you're not sure what to do with them. It gives you an idea to take those stones, make something out of them, especially if you're a seed beater and you've had the stones and you're not sure what to do with them. This kind of gives you an idea of something else to do with the stones as well. Again, if you need any of the materials, the bugles, the seed beads, any of those, at the beginning of the video, we have that little drop-down menu for you. Again, if you're on a mobile or an iPad, that might not come up. But underneath the videos, there's always a description that says what the videos are about. There's a little down arrow that says show more. You can click on that and it'll give you links to all the different materials that were used in this as well. As always, if you like this YouTube video, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel to get regular updates on this and other patterns that we do, as well as introductions to new beads and what's going on in the beading world as well. You can feel free to shop from me at potomacbeads.com and also stay connected with us through Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, as well as join our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making. There you can show off kind of what you're making, give ideas, share inspiration, and look at the wonderful creations that people make. And it's really a helpful community where people are there offering ideas and suggestions, giving tips, and showing off their fun jewelry making skills as well. As always, everybody, thank you so much for watching and enjoy making this seed bead caged gemstone.